When people talk about George Lucas and Star Wars, the sequel trilogy is not something that comes to mind, as it was made after George Lucas sold Lucasfilm in 2012 and let other directors take the wheel. But the question remains, was there an involvement by Lucas, or was he completely out of the picture? Well, to answer that question, we need to take a few things into consideration. The first is that Lucas had several outlines for a sequel trilogy, dating all the way back to before the release of A New Hope in 1977. All varied depending on what Lucas wanted to focus on, and thus were a reflection of the Star Wars franchise at the time. For the sake of brevity, we will focus on the two last outlines he created, one of which is the final outline he worked on from 2011 to 2013. The first outline, or what we know from it at least, would have dealt with several events shortly after Return of the Jedi. Mainly, it would have centered on Leia, now a senator, rebuilding the New Republic and getting it under control from the gangsters, while Luke began rebuilding the Jedi Order. The main antagonists of this trilogy would have been stormtroopers who never surrendered and who Lucas described as space ISIS, as he drew parallels to the Iraq War, with these stormtroopers being similar to the forces of Saddam Hussein, who later joined ISIS. The dark side would have been led by Darth Maul, now with robotic legs, who would have become the godfather of crime, and a younger descendant of him who was bigger and had spider legs. If this sounds familiar, it should be, because these ideas would then be used in the Clone Wars TV show. Maul would have had an apprentice, Darth Talon, but not the version from the expanded universe, as that character existed over 100 years after the events of Return of the Jedi. According to Lucas, she would have been the Darth Vader of the trilogy. By the end of the trilogy, Luke would have rebuilt the Jedi Order, and Leia would have rebuilt the Republic, becoming Supreme Chancellor. It would have also been revealed that Leia was the chosen one all along, likely a nod to Yoda's line from The Empire Strikes Back, "No, there is another one." This outline never materialized, and the idea of a sequel trilogy became unlikely. That is, until 2011, when Lucas decided to give it another go at the idea of a sequel trilogy. To properly focus more on the trilogy, Lucas called her old friend and talented producer Kathleen Kennedy to join her as co-chairman in Lucasfilm, and that she would become president once Lucas retired. In early 2012, he secretly met with Mark Hamill and Carrie Fisher so that they could reprise their characters. And around the same time, Harrison Ford, despite having a rocky relationship with the character, agreed to return as Han Solo, on the condition that his character would be giving meaningful closure. He brought on board veteran Star Wars writer Lawrence Kasdan and the writer of Toy Story 3, Little Miss Sunshine, and The Hunger Games Catching Fire, Michael Arndt, to help him out with the script. Now, it should be stated that George Lucas wasn't making this trilogy out of some creative desire to continue the franchise. He was making it as a way to sweeten the pot so that he could attract companies to buy Lucasfilm so that he could retire. So what was the story for this new trilogy? Well, it would have centered around a new group of young characters, mainly a female scavenger that had a connection with the Force who would have befriended a guy and together would have fought against forces of evil. Most notably, Han and Leia's son, who had fallen to the dark side and worshipped Darth Vader by keeping his burnt mask. Luke would have been in exile after being betrayed by one of his apprentices, having lost his faith in the Jedi, and though reluctant at first, he would eventually train the scavenger as a Jedi. Now, this all sounds very familiar, doesn't it? Okay, to be fair, let me explain better how all of these elements would have played out in this version. Lucas wanted for the main characters of this trilogy to be the grandchildren of Anakin Skywalker, who would have been in their 20s, because the first trilogy was centered on the father, the second one on the son, and the third one was going to be centered around the grandson. The protagonist would have been a female scavenger that would become a Jedi throughout the trilogy. She went through several names, but one that stuck out the most was Kira. She was going to team up with a guy called Skylar, who is shown carrying a blaster. Kira became Rey, and after several changes, Skylar became Finn. The son of Han Solo and Leia would have fallen to the dark side and was known as the Jedi Killer, who is presumably a precursor to Kylo Ren. He would have been seduced to the dark side by Darth Talon, who served a Sith Lord named Uber, and when I say seduced, I literally mean seduced. The idea of Han and Leia's son falling to the dark side was always in the mix, but the finished film decided to have it as an established fact. The Jedi Killer and some elements from Darth Talon became Kylo Ren, and Uber became Supreme Leader Snoke. Luke in this version would have been a master in exile on a remote planet where the first Jedi Temple would have been. He would have hidden in a cave for so long that he went blind. He was haunted by the betrayal of one of his students and spiritually in a dark place. Lucas drew parallels between Luke and Colonel Kurtz, played by Marlon Brando, in the film Apocalypse Now. The similarities between this Luke and the one from the final version are very noticeable. Another thing that is very noticeable between the two versions is that Luke would have been reluctant to train the character of the female scavenger, but eventually would agree to train her, and that both would have died at the end of episode 8. Not much is known about Han or Leia in this version of the story, but what is known is that the Millennium Falcon would have been in Felucia, a planet first shown in episode 3, and that there would have likely been space pirates involved. A planet filled with junk and destroyed Imperial equipment seems to have always been present since the beginning, likely becoming the planet of Jakku, though it wasn't always a desert. Darth Vader's castle, which had been a concept that had originated in Empire Strikes Back, was also planned to appear, but didn't appear in episode 7 and would instead appear in the next film, Rogue One, a Star Wars story. There is, however, one key aspect of Lucas' sequel trilogy that was left out entirely from the finished version of the sequel trilogy, and it's that part of it would have taken place in a microbiotic world that was going to expand the concept of midichlorians and how they connected with organisms called the Whills that apparently had always been in the mix, dating all the way back to one of the earliest story treatments for the first Star Wars film, which was called Adventures of the Starkiller, as taken from the Journal of the Whills, Saga I, the Star Wars. As you can tell from these outlines, the expanded universe were not going to be used in the story, as Lucas didn't see them as his stories, but rather someone else's. Well, except for Darth Talon, that is. There is also another thing that needs to be taken into consideration, which is that there are certain ideas that made it into the final version that come from Michael Arndt's script that was based on Lucas' story treatments. The first and most noticeable one was that it was his idea to have Luke only be a silent cameo in episode 7, as he realized that after trying to add Luke more prominently into the story, it simply didn't work, as according to him, it took interest away from the new characters. The second one was that in his version, the idea of the submerged second Death Star appeared, in which the characters search for a MacGuffin, which likely inspired the one from The Rise of Skywalker. So, the plan was that Lucas was going to direct episode 7 with a planned May 2015 release, and then letting other directors take over episodes 8 and 9, but, fun fact, no. Now, there is no official reason as to why George Lucas decided to not direct episode 7 and sell the company, but it's theorized that likely the critical and commercial failure of Red Tails made him change his mind about making the sequel trilogy. By mid-2012, he began negotiations with Disney to sell Lucasfilm and find a director for episode 7. Lucas's conditions were that Kathleen Kennedy would become president of Lucasfilm after he was retired and that his story treatments would be used. Disney agreed on the condition that they had the final say on the films. They agreed, and so on October 30th, 2012, the sale of Lucasfilm was finalized and was announced to the public. Many directors were considered to direct episode 7, but after a recommendation from Steven Spielberg, Lucas personally handpicked J.J. Abrams to direct and spearhead the new trilogy, alongside the writers that Lucas had chosen and key production members. Lucas would remain as a creative consultant, but he was no longer giving ideas, but rather approving them. However, he had no direct involvement with the film itself. By 2013, they came to the conclusion that, because of the mixed reception by critics and audiences of the prequels and the need to please Star Wars fans, they needed to start from scratch and make something new for the fans, especially because of the whole midichlorians thing. So they decided to move away from the treatments that Lucas wrote, which, to put it mildly, disappointed Lucas. Now it must be stated that despite Lucas being upset that his story treatments weren't used, he understood why they did it and even acknowledged that fans would love the movie. Fortunately, it seems that Lucas's relationship with them seems to have improved. He spoke positively of Rogue One and The Last Jedi, had cursory involvement with Solo: A Star Wars Story, which is a film that began production while he was still in charge, and has been invited to the set of almost every Star Wars project, something which he still does to this day. So in conclusion, despite having some differences, Lucas's outlines for a sequel trilogy and the finished sequel trilogy share several things: an older generation passing the torch to a new generation, a female scavenger turned Jedi, the son of Han and Leia falling to the dark side, a group of stormtroopers that never surrendered, and Luke being in exile who, though reluctant at first, would eventually train the scavenger, showing that the sequel trilogy shares more in common with George Lucas's ideas than one might have been led to believe. I hope you enjoyed this episode and thank you for watching.